I've been thinking about something that almost never gets discussed honestly, and it has nothing to do with cholesterol numbers or blood sugar readings. I'm Frank, I'm 67, and I spent about 15 years as a family physician before stepping back to what I'd call a more reflective pace of life. And in all those years of practice, I can count on one hand the number of times I sat across from a patient and said, "Tell me about who you talk to. Tell me about your days. Tell me who knows you." We checked everything else with impressive thoroughness: blood pressure, kidney function, bone density. But the one thing that was quietly undermining all of it, we barely touched. Here's what started me thinking about this more seriously. A few years ago, right around the time I turned 64, my wife took a 6-week trip to care for her sister across the country. 6 weeks. I had the house to myself, my routine intact, my work, my hobbies, and somewhere around week 3, I noticed something odd. I wasn't sleeping as well. My lower back, which had been fine, started bothering me. I felt vaguely irritable in a way I couldn't explain. I wasn't depressed, I want to be clear about that. I was just less engaged, less energized, less interested in cooking a real meal or taking the longer walk.
And I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, realizing that I had not had a real conversation with another human being in 4 days. 4 days! I'd exchanged pleasantries, I'd answered emails, but I hadn't actually talked to someone the way you do when it matters in 4 days. And I thought, this is uncomfortable information, because I have the social resources of someone who is relatively privileged, a career full of relationships, a stable marriage, friends I could call, and I still slid into something that felt hollow surprisingly fast. That's what I want to explore with you today. Not as a warning, not as a checklist to complete, but as a genuinely interesting and I think under-examined part of what it means to age well. Because the research on loneliness and social connection in later life is, when you dig into it, genuinely fascinating, and it points to something much more interesting than a simple public health problem. Let's start with what's actually happening in the body when we're isolated, because I think understanding the mechanism changes how you think about the solution. Human beings are, and this is not metaphor, this is biology, wired for social proximity. Our nervous systems developed in an environment where being separated from the group meant danger. Being alone in a prehistoric landscape was not a neutral condition. It was a signal that something had gone wrong. And so our bodies evolved to treat isolation as a threat state. When you're lonely, and I mean genuinely lonely, not just alone, there's a difference we'll get to. Your body activates what researchers call a threat response. Cortisol levels rise, inflammatory markers go up, sleep architecture changes, the immune system shifts toward a more defensive, less efficient mode. Now, here's the part that I find remarkable. These changes are not trivial. Studies, including longitudinal work from Brigham Young University and a well-known meta-analysis by Julianne Holt-Lundstad, suggest that chronic loneliness is associated with health outcomes comparable to smoking roughly 15 cigarettes a day. The comparison to high blood pressure is actually conservative. Some of the data put social isolation ahead of obesity as a risk factor for premature mortality. And I want to be honest with you here. These are association studies with real methodological complexity. They don't prove that loneliness causes death the way a pathogen causes infection, but the signal is strong enough and the biological mechanisms plausible enough that dismissing it seems like willful negligence. What I find more interesting than the statistics, though, is the question of why this is happening now, in this particular way, to people in their 60s and beyond. Because here's something that doesn't get said often enough. Many of us who are in our 60s, 70s, or beyond built our social worlds around structures that quietly dissolved. Work relationships, neighborhood proximity, children in the house, couples who socialized as a unit.
religious communities, civic organizations. These weren't just activities, they were the architecture of belonging. They provided what sociologists call passive social contact, which is a wonderful phrase. It means the kind of connection you don't have to initiate, that just happens because you're embedded in a shared context. And then retirement comes, or children leave, or a spouse dies, or you move somewhere quieter, and the architecture is gone. And suddenly, all social connection requires active effort. Every relationship requires initiation. There's no shared context pulling you into contact with other people automatically. And that's exhausting, particularly for people who are introverted, or grieving, or dealing with mobility changes, or who simply haven't had to actively build community since they were in their 20s. I think this is worth sitting with for a moment, because I hear people say, and I've thought this myself, I'm not lonely, I just like my own company. And that may be completely true. Solitude and loneliness are genuinely different experiences. Solitude is chosen, nourishing, restorative. Loneliness is the gap between the connection you have and the connection you need. It's a felt discrepancy. And some people have a much lower need for social contact than others. That's real, and it's okay. But it's also worth asking honestly, is the preference for solitude a genuine temperamental reality, or has it become a kind of accommodation, a way of making peace with something that started as circumstance? I'm not suggesting everyone needs an active social life in some extroverted sense. I'm suggesting that the question is worth asking without judgment and with genuine curiosity about the answer. Now, here's something I've thought about quite a bit, and I think it reframes the whole conversation in a useful way. There's a difference between quantity of social contact and quality of social connection, and I think we often conflate them in ways that make the problem seem both bigger and more manageable than it actually is.
Some people have extensive social contact. They go to group fitness classes, they have family dinners, they're at community events regularly, and still feel profoundly lonely, because none of those interactions involve being truly known. They're pleasant, they're warm, they're not nothing, but they don't involve the kind of vulnerability, the kind of sustained mutual attention that creates what you might call genuine intimacy. Not romantic intimacy necessarily, but the intimacy of being seen, of having someone in your life who knows your history, your complexity, your doubts, your humor. Someone who, if you didn't show up, would notice and care. And on the other side, some people with quite limited social contact, a few deep friendships, a partner they communicate with honestly, maybe one community they belong to with genuine investment, feel connected, purposeful, and alive, because the quality of what's there is sufficient to meet the underlying need. So, if I were to offer a framework for thinking about your own situation, it would be less about counting your social activities and more about asking, do I have people in my life who know me? Not just people who like me or enjoy my company, but people who actually know me, the fuller, more complex version. And if the answer is yes, even if it's only 2 or 3 people, that is not a small thing. That may be the most important thing.
If the answer is less clear, that's interesting too. It's not an indictment, it's information, and information is useful. Here's where I want to talk about grief for a moment, because I think it lives at the center of this conversation in ways we often don't acknowledge directly. A lot of the loneliness that people experience after 60 is bound up in loss. The loss of a spouse, which I think is one of the most disorienting human experiences there is, not just because of grief, but because a long partnership reorganizes your entire social identity. You are half of a pair that no longer exists, and you have to figure out who you are when you're no longer that. The loss of colleagues when you retire, the loss of parents, which even at 60 or 70 carries its own particular weight, the sudden awareness that you are now the oldest generation. The loss of friends to illness and death, which accelerates in this chapter of life in ways that are genuinely hard to absorb. The loss, sometimes, of physical capacities that made certain kinds of connection possible. Grief is social work. It requires witnesses. It requires people who will sit with you in the hard parts without rushing you toward resolution. And one of the cruelest aspects of loneliness in later life is that people often become more isolated precisely when they have the most to grieve, which means they're doing this inherently relational work in isolation, which makes it both harder and slower. I want to say something here that I don't think gets said enough in health-oriented contexts. Grief is not a problem to solve. It's a process to move through, and moving through it well almost always requires other people. Not to fix it, not to offer perspective or silver linings, just to be present with you in it.
If you're in a season of significant loss and you find yourself increasingly withdrawing, I gently suggest that the withdrawal, however natural it feels, may be working against you. Not because you should be performing wellness or showing up to things you don't have the energy for, but because the connection you most need right now is probably also the hardest to reach for. That's worth knowing about yourself. Let me shift to something more practical, because I don't want to dwell in the heavy territory without talking about what actually helps. One thing I've found genuinely useful, both in my own life and in conversations with people over the years, is thinking about social connection not as a destination to arrive at, but as a practice to maintain. Just like physical conditioning, the capacity for connection requires regular use, and also, like physical conditioning, it's much easier to maintain than to rebuild after a significant decline. What does this mean practically? For some people, it means protecting certain recurring commitments as near sacred: a weekly lunch with a friend, a standing phone call, a regular gathering that anchors the week. Not because those specific activities are irreplaceable, but because they create the conditions for the kind of ongoing, evolving contact that deepens into genuine intimacy over time. Intimacy doesn't happen in a single conversation. It accumulates across many conversations, across time, across shared experience. For other people, the entry point is activity-based, finding a shared purpose or interest that brings them into regular contact with others, and allowing the relationships to develop naturally from that shared context. This is, interestingly, how most of us made friends when we were younger, through school, through work, through neighborhoods, before we understood what we were actually doing. We were building passive social contact structures. And it's possible to intentionally recreate that in later life, though it requires a bit more awareness because it no longer happens automatically. I want to acknowledge something real here. Making new friends after 60 is legitimately harder than it was at 25. This isn't a personal failing or a sign of some deficit, it's a structural reality. The contexts that made friendship easy are largely gone. People's lives are more settled and in some ways more closed. Time feels more precious and less expandable. There's a certain guardedness that comes from having lived long enough to experience the cost of loss, and that guardedness protects you, but also keeps people at a distance. So if you've tried to build new connections and found it slow or awkward or discouraging, that's not evidence that it's impossible or that you're doing it wrong. It's evidence that it's hard, and hard things require patience and persistence and a certain willingness to feel awkward for longer than feels comfortable. One thing I've noticed is that genuine reciprocity is the engine of real friendship, and sometimes people, especially people who have been very capable, very giving, very competent throughout their lives, have a hard time being on the receiving end of care and attention. If you've spent decades being the helper, being the one who has things together, there can be a kind of pride or discomfort in being the one who reaches out and says, honestly, I've been feeling isolated and I'd love to spend more time with you. That vulnerability is exactly what friendship requires, and it gets easier with practice.
I also want to say something about technology and what it can and can't do here, because it's a real part of most people's social landscape now. Video calls and phone calls and text messages can genuinely maintain relationships that already exist. They can bridge distance. They can keep you in the daily texture of someone's life even when you're not physically present. These are not nothing. I think we sometimes dismiss them as lesser than face-to-face contact in ways that aren't entirely fair. What technology is generally less good at is creating new depth from scratch. It's harder to move from pleasant acquaintance to genuine friendship in a purely digital context. Not impossible, but harder. And the kind of connection that most powerfully counteracts loneliness involves physical presence, the regulation that happens when you're in a room with someone you care about, when you can touch their arm, when you're sharing a meal, when you're breathing the same air. There's something in co-presence that doesn't fully translate through a screen, and I think it's worth being honest about that, even as we appreciate what technology offers. There's one more dimension I want to explore before we bring this together, and it's one that I think is underrepresented in conversations about senior health: purpose. I've come to believe that purpose and connection are not separate topics, they're deeply intertwined. One of the most effective antidotes to loneliness is having something that draws you into contact with others in a way that feels meaningful. When you're working towards something you care about, a project, a community, a cause, a craft, the social connections that form around that work have a particular quality of vitality. They're not just pleasant, they're nourishing in a more specific way because they're aligned with something you're genuinely invested in. I've watched people come alive after retirement when they found work, not paid work necessarily, but purposeful work that put them in regular contact with people who shared their values and interests. And I've watched others retreat into smaller and smaller lives precisely because they lost the sense of having something to contribute, something to show up for, something that needed them. This isn't about staying busy. It's about the particular satisfaction of mattering to something beyond your own comfort. And it's a thread worth pulling on, especially if you find yourself feeling disconnected but can't quite identify why. Sometimes the loneliness isn't primarily about lack of contact, it's about lack of meaning, and those call for different responses.
So, here's how I'd synthesize all of this into something you can actually use. Connection is not a luxury or a nice-to-have. It is, as far as we can tell from both biology and decades of accumulated human wisdom, a fundamental requirement for health and well-being in the deepest sense. Not just physical health, though the effects there are real and significant, but the health of being a person, being seen, being known, being part of something. The question isn't whether you have enough friends in some quantitative sense. It's whether you have enough genuine intimacy, enough relationships where you are actually known, and enough contact with those relationships to keep them alive and evolving. If that feels sufficient in your life, protect it. Don't take it for granted. The structures that support it need tending. If it feels like something is missing, approach that not as a failure, but as an interesting problem with real solutions. Think about the architecture you've lost and how you might intentionally build new structures, shared contexts, recurring commitments, purpose-driven work that make connection easier. Think about your own barriers, whether they're circumstantial or temperamental or tied up in grief or pride, and whether there's anything there worth gently challenging. And if you're in a season of significant loneliness right now, I'd say this: you are not alone in being alone. This is one of the most common and least spoken about experiences of later life. Reaching toward connection, even when it feels difficult or awkward or late, is one of the most intelligent and courageous things you can do. Not because someone told you it's healthy, but because you are a human being, and this is what human beings need. I'm Frank. I'll keep thinking about these things, and I hope you will too. Do like and subscribe if you would love to see more contents like this.